Good afternoon and welcome again to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. I'm continuing today my series on the minimalist approach to the resurrection and to arguing for the resurrection and why that's inferior and significantly inferior to the maximal data approach that I favor. I've made a YouTube playlist on this topic, so that kind of conveniently gathers them together. I'll add this to that playlist, and you can look in that new playlist to find not only videos on this channel, but videos on other channels where I've discussed this topic. I just had a discussion yesterday with my husband Tim, with Pat Flynn of Chronicles of Strength, of our Blackwell article in 2009 of the argument for the resurrection. So I think you'll be interested to see that if you like that kind of long form discussion. I want to recap briefly, I don't want to redo it all obviously, what some of the things are that I've been saying in these recent videos. I've been arguing that you cannot make a substitute for a robust maximal case for the resurrection by using more minimal kinds of arguments. So for example, to substitute things like the many scholars grant that the Gospels, or that the disciples had some kind of appearances, that Jesus had some kind of appearances to his disciples. To supplement that with the idea that they, as good Jews, were not expecting his resurrection before the apocalyptic end of the age, and so they weren't in a place where they were going to, dream up experiences. Some of these, especially the second of those, can be a supplement to a robust case, but it won't do as a substitute for a robust case. And in particular, something I hinted in the last video, but I want to expand upon in this video, is that you can't substitute the idea that there was an early tradition of the conceptual content that Jesus was physically resurrected and substitute that for talking about the details of what they actually claimed, and then arguing that the accounts are not embellished and that therefore this really is what the original witnesses claimed, at least. And I especially argued in the previous video against granting, even for the sake of the argument, that the accounts are embellished, because if you do that, I argued, that's actually going straight up against the conclusion that you want to argue for in the end, which is that they were rational to believe this. And so if the accounts were embellished, that tends to provide some evidence that they had to embellish them because they didn't really have such robust experiences to begin with. In this video, I want to address a certain potential probabilistic confusion, and I don't know how many people are confused by this. I had a very useful blog exchange, very cordial blog exchange some months ago with a reader. I might try to find that and put it in the show notes. It was in the comments thread, that led me to think that there might be people out there who have a particular conceptual confusion about what I call a probabilistic bottleneck, that is leading them to think that they can make the more minimalist approach more robust. And so this confusion is related to a particular probability that is what we call a conditional probability. And this is read the probability of R here given B. Probability of R given B. And so by R, I mean the bodily resurrection. I mean a very strong, that he actually was physically resurrected. And then by B, I'm going to mean that the disciples believed and taught that he was physically resurrected, but without saying anything one way or another about why they believed and taught that, but just that they did believe and teach that he was physically resurrected. Now, I definitely would agree that B is evidence for R. Now, in that, as we look here again at my extremely high-tech technique that I've got here, that obviously the probability of R given B is greater than the probability of R given not B. Obviously, if they didn't believe that he was physically resurrected, we would not even be discussing this. If we knew that they didn't even believe that, even the people in a position to know, then why would we even be talking about the physical resurrection of Jesus? So clearly, B is some evidence for R, even described at that level of generality. And so, older scholars sometimes would say that the very idea of the physical resurrection was a later addition to the tradition. It wasn't an early tradition, and that the earliest disciples were not teaching a physical resurrection, and obviously that needed to be countered, that needed to be answered. So, nothing that I am saying is saying that the belief of the disciples is of no evidential value whatsoever, even if we don't discuss why they believed it or what they believed about the details of their experience. It has evidential value. But what I'm arguing is that it cannot stand alone without getting into that more detailed discussion. I want to give a kind of a ordinary real-world example here that may help to show how this could be the case. Suppose that you knew a woman who had come to believe that her husband was unfaithful to her, and you were feeling really sorry for her, and you were talking to then another friend who was still very close to the husband and was saying, no, not him. I can't believe this. And suppose the friend said, well, why does she believe that? And you said, well, I don't know. She hasn't told me. I haven't wanted to pry, and I don't have those details, but she really believes it. And the friend said, no, until I have more detailed evidence, I'm not going to accept that about this man that I know, and I have so much evidence of his good character, etc. And now suppose that you're trying to counter that person's skepticism about the unfaithfulness of the husband, and you just keep on saying, well, she told me that 2 weeks ago. She's been consistently saying it for weeks. She seems just absolutely convinced. She's filed for divorce. She's changing her whole life and so forth as a result of this. She seems convinced that he's been unfaithful. And the person is going to say to you, quite understandably, yes, okay, I agree. I grant you that she believes it, but my question is whether she's reasonable to believe it. And just by bringing more and more evidence that she believes it, you cannot answer my question, which is, why does she believe it? And is there really enough reason for us to believe that it's true? Of course, her believing it is where all of this gets started. And so, sure, her believing it is of some evidential value, but it can't stand alone without a more detailed case. And just telling me more and more and more stuff to convince me, no, she's really sincere, she really believes this, is not sufficient. So I think that really helps to illustrate it. And so then let me talk a little bit about the probability of this here. So this line here is called the solidus. Okay, right here, this up and down line. And then this proposition here, B, is called the proposition to the right of the solidus. When we consider a conditional probability like that, I think it's helpful to think of it as a counterfactual. Suppose we knew B with certainty, what would be the probability of R? So you can think of probability of R given B in that sort of counterfactual way. Well, notice that counterfactual imaginative situation is taking B to be absolutely proved. And to some extent, that's a fiction. If it's an empirical thing, it's never going to be absolutely proved. But just as in the situation with the woman and her husband, the friend grants to you, even if I were certain, absolutely certain that she believed it, I'm still looking for more data. So suppose we had at certainty that the disciples believed and taught at this level, and we're not saying in detail what they believed and taught, but that they believed and taught that Jesus was physically resurrected. It was very early tradition. How far would that get us? You can't make that conditional probability stronger by just arguing more and more and more for the proposition to the right of the solidus, because the limit of what you can achieve there is to get it certain. And we're saying, well, okay, but even if it were at that limit, we're not convinced that that's enough, especially if you're not willing to defend more detailed propositions, and even more if you grant that that the accounts are embellished. So you're not going to increase that conditional probability by increasing the probability of the proposition to the right of the solidus. And so I hope that's a little bit techy, but I hope that's helpful. Now let me just show you how sometimes this indirect argument goes. I'm going to get into a little more detail on this than I did in the previous video. This argument for an early tradition of conceptual content rather than an argument that the Gospels contain what the early witnesses claimed. In Michael Licona's big book on the resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, there's a page where he's talking about the nature of the resurrection appearances. And he talks about the Apostle Paul and that he thinks the Apostle Paul conceived them as physical. And then he talks about Luke. And in Luke, as we know, Jesus eats something. They doubt that he's physically resurrected, and they and he asks them to bring him food, and he eats. So Licona mentions the physical nature of the appearance account in Luke. And you might think, oh, okay, he's gonna argue for the physical resurrection from the physical resurrection account. Sort of. And there's a subtle difference here, because what he does is he says Luke thought of the resurrection as physical. And it's kind of interesting. Well, of course, I agree. Luke did think of the resurrection as physical. But notice the difference between saying Luke thought of the resurrection as physical, and that's why he put this story in there, and saying this story came from the eyewitnesses. This is actually what they claimed, that Jesus did eat fish with them and honeycomb, and that's why they thought of the resurrection as physical, or that appears to be why. That's what they're claiming, and that's why Luke put it in here. Instead, you're using this as a guide to Luke's conception of the resurrection. Now, it's a subtle difference, and I could well have imagined myself back when that resurrection book first came out, when I hadn't been sort of clued in to the way minimalism works, that I could have just read right past that passage and thought that he's actually making the same kind of argument I'm making, but it's actually different. It's not the same. What you're really arguing, and what he's really arguing for there, is that this early tradition that Jesus' resurrection was physical, but not necessarily depending. In fact, he specifically says that he's prescinded from treating the gospel accounts as historical bedrock in themselves, okay? But he's using it simply as a guide to the way Luke thought, the way Paul thought, what the early tradition was. Sometimes you'll hear people say, supplement this, I've seen this in various places, that Paul said that the disciples gave him the right hand of fellowship. They added nothing to his gospel. He says this in his letters. And so Paul's gospel was the same as the apostles' gospel. So if Paul's gospel was that Jesus was physically resurrected, that was also the apostles' gospel. That's fine. It's an argument for B. It's fine, if you want to argue that this is what they believed and taught. But once again, what are we doing? Are we just trying to counter a claim that isn't even what they taught? Or are we trying to make a claim that they were correct and that they were rational to believe that? That's not going to get you any farther with that than just B itself. And similarly, in Reasonable Faith, there's a passage where Dr. Bill Craig talks a little bit about the gospel accounts of the resurrection, and he says something like, and this is a paraphrase, but he says, all of the gospel accounts envisage Jesus' resurrection as physical. And I presume that for Mark, which doesn't have any appearances, he is thinking of the empty tomb there, I would guess. But then the others also have appearances where they actually say something to the effect that Jesus was able to be touched, or he ate, or something to that effect. And so he says all of the gospel accounts envision Jesus' resurrection as physical in nature. And then he says if none of the appearances really did seem to be physical in nature, if none of the appearances really were physical in nature, then why would this have arisen so early, this view of Jesus' resurrection as physical, which we find in the gospel accounts? Now, again, if I weren't wondering, okay, is this the same as the way I would make the argument, or is this different? I might just read right past that. But remember that earlier in Reasonable Faith, Dr. Craig has said that the apologist should not be saddled, and that is his word, with arguing that the Gospels are historically reliable, even generally historically reliable, in order to argue for the resurrection. So he can't be arguing the same way that I am. And I think what he's doing there is something that in other contexts Dr. Licona has referred to as a multiple attestation of a motif. That's a phrase, I think that's original with him. And the idea is that you have multiple attestation to a kind of a propositional abstract concept that you've abstracted from the historical account. So, for example, you might abstract the idea that Jesus cast out demons from multiple accounts of Jesus casting out demons. So the proposition, Jesus cast out demons. So similarly here, from multiple resurrection accounts, Dr. Craig is getting the statement, the resurrection was physical, and he's saying that would seem to be awfully soon for it to arise if none of the actual resurrection appearance experiences was physical in nature. Well, again, I'm not going to say that's completely valueless, but what that really is, in effect, is that's an attempt to argue from B to R. Okay, but while not saddling oneself with the idea that these are reliably recorded accounts of, in detail, what the early witnesses said. Okay, so you see the distinction there. So I do think that sometimes people are confused about this, and this was interesting to me and revelatory to me in this cordial exchange I had with a reader, where, he kept saying, but what about this, that shows that this really was an early tradition and so forth. And I kept saying, well, all that's going to get you is that this is what they believed and taught. And I call that a bottleneck here. You're routing it through B. And I think he did finally see the point. So it occurred to me that there might be more people out there who are confused in the same way. A cumulative case that the apostles taught early, the abstract propositional content that Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, is not the same thing as a cumulative case that Jesus actually was resurrected from the dead. And you cannot make the physical case that Jesus actually was resurrected from the dead stronger and stronger indefinitely, where the sky's the limit, for R, just by making a stronger and stronger cumulative case for B, because as the limit to that is going to be the conditional probability of R given B. And then what I have been arguing is that in the face of other concessions, or in the context of a refusal to supplement that with other arguments, there is a legitimate doubt about how high the probability of R given B is when you're doing it in this minimal way. And in particular, maybe it's more probable than not, but is it probable enough to warrant the kind of acceptance and life commitment that it calls for and should call for? So I hope that wasn't, too tacky, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do in this series and in these videos. And I don't even know what I'm going to do for my video next time. I would love to be able to give you a teaser. Hey, come back next time, and this is what I'll be talking about, but I have a lot going on right now, so I don't know, but I'm sure I'll be inspired to do something next week that will be interesting. So please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you to all of my subscribers who already have. I'll see you next time.